Passo agora a palavra ao Capitão Angelo, Diretor-Geral Adjunto da Associação Internacional de Armadores Independentes de Navios Petroleiros, Intertanko. Angelo foi diretor-geral entre 2011 e 2012 e diretor de Assuntos Regulatórios e das Américas entre 2005 e 2010. Iniciou sua carreira em 1977 na Guarda Costeira Americana. Em 95, tornou-se o primeiro diretor de padrões de segurança de navegação, salvaguarda da vida humana e prevenção da poluição hídrica da Guarda Costeira Americana. De 1984 a 2004, chefiou inúmeras delegações dos Estados Unidos nas comissões de segurança da navegação e prevenção da poluição, NAVE, MSC e MEPC, da Organização Marítima Internacional RIMO. O Capitão Angelo falará sobre os desafios para o exercício da praticagem.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Intertanko, I would like to thank Ricardo and Conapra for inviting me to come here to speak at this very important seminar. Before I get to my presentation, though, I have a few administrative comments to get through. First of all, my age. I am not going to stand up here and lie about my age like the other speakers have. The only thing I will tell you is I am younger than all the previous speakers. Okay. Second comment. I worked for many, many years for the U.S. Coast Guard. My boss was always the Admiral. I'm very impressed, Admiral de Veros. In the Coast Guard, a 3-star Admiral comes, makes an opening speech, and then leaves. Never stays after the break. I thank you for staying and listening. This tells me how important it is to the Brazilian Navy in dealing with this issue. My third comment. I looked through the agenda and found out last night and noticed that I am the only speaker here representing ship owners. So, in that regard, I would make the following comments. First, I come here speaking representing Intertanko. I am not here speaking on behalf of all ship owners on this issue. That's an important point to make. The second comment I would make is that, and I mentioned this to Ricardo last night, as I am the only ship owners representative speaking, I hope I'm not being set up and will suffer the wrath of the other ship owners. But, even if I am being set up to set up their wrath, as far as Intertanko is concerned, we believe what we're doing is right, and what I'm about to tell you we think is the right way to go forward and how to deal with this issue. So, with that, let me talk about my presentation. I'd like to break it down into basically 3 areas. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about Intertanko, so you know who we are, who we represent, and what we do, what our focus is. Second, I would like to talk about the relationship that Intertanko has with IMPA, the International Maritime Pilots Association. And then third, and most importantly, of course, Intertanko and our relationship that's ongoing with Brazil and various entities in Brazil. Okay? So first, a little propaganda about Intertanko. Intertanko is the International Association of Independent Tanker Owners. We are a non-profit organization, and here you see what our aims are. My intention is not to read every slide to you. I would let you read this. But most importantly, we work for safety at sea and protection of the marine environment from our members. That is our main focus. The mission that we established for ourselves is to provide leadership to the tanker industry in serving the world with the safe, environmentally sound, and efficient seaborne transportation of oil and gas. And associated with this mission, we identified 7 goals that we wanted to achieve. I didn't want to go through all the goals, but this is the most important goal that we have achieved. And this is the goal that our members wanted to impose upon themselves. This is not for the Secretariat, this is for the members that operate the tankers. They decided they wanted to continuously lead the continuous improvement of the tanker industry's performance, striving to achieve the goals of 0 fatalities, 0 pollution, and 0 detentions. There was some discussion about whether we should choose 0 as our goal. Some people said it's never achievable. But the philosophy was, better have the glass half full than half empty. And this is why they chose this goal. Membership, just so you know, is open to independent tanker owners. Oil companies, state-owned tanker operators are not independent tanker owners, so they are not eligible to be members of Intertanko, but they can be associate members of Intertanko. And in associate members, we have those that are related to the tanker industry. So this could include class societies, shipyards, service providers, law firms, P&I clubs, and we have quite a few dealing with that. So if anybody here has any interest in joining Intertanko as either a member or an associate member, of course, please contact me. This is where we stand right now, starting in 2013. We have a little more than 220 members, more than 3,200 tankers, with more than 280 million tons. We're in 40 different countries, and I'm proud to say that we have members in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Colombia. And I shouldn't leave out Mexico, it's part of Latin America also. And we represent more than 70% of the world's independent tanker fleet. Now, this past year, our council, which is our policy setting body, decided we should adopt a 5-year strategic plan. And so that was adopted. And these are the 7 major issues that they adopted as part of our 5-year strategic plan. I just wanted to point this out so you see what the first 2 issues are. The first one is the sustainability of the tanker industry. If you don't know, the tanker industry is in very significant financial trouble right now. Too many tankers out there right now. So we're trying to make sure our members can survive. But second on that list is tanker safety and performance. Now for these 2 major issues, I don't want to talk about all of them, just these 2. We had developed, what do we want to desired outcome? What is it we want to achieve for each of these issues? So for the sustainability, we want to achieve that members have access to the tools, models, and information that they need to continue operating safely. And for tanker safety and performance, we want our members to proactively be positioned for top performance. I emphasize all of this because there's a common theme I think you see here: safety. Intertanko wants to make sure, all of our members want to make sure that we are operating our tankers safely throughout the world. We have a committee structure. We have a technical committee, an environmental committee, a navigation committee. I didn't want to bore you with all the details. Pertinent to this particular seminar, though, we do have a pilotage working group. These are members that volunteer their services to specifically advise Intertanko on what are the issues that we should be addressing, what should we do with regard to pilotage issues. And the 2 main issues we focus on are fostering relationships with both national and international pilot associations, and also to review and provide input and recommendations on any of the latest requirements or guidelines that are coming out of IMO or anywhere else in the world. So that's briefly an overview of Intertanko. That didn't take too long and bore you too much. Let me turn now to leading up to our development with IMPA. Let's start with a couple of basic facts, and some of these have already been identified. Fact 1, everyone, I think, will agree, we all want safe navigation of ships through all the nation's ports and waterways. I don't think anybody can disagree with that. And fact number 2 that we have to accept. The pilots are mandated through national legislation to assist in the safe navigation of ships through that nation's waters. And then the third fact that I think was mentioned earlier that cannot change. Intertanko members do not get to choose the pilot they put on their ship. So if you start with those 3 basic facts, what does Intertanko, what do our members expect? Well, what we want are pilots that will be knowledgeable and properly trained to ensure that voyages in pilotage waters are incident-free. And I should also add, at a fair and reasonable cost. Now you notice I did not say at the cheapest cost possible. At a fair and reasonable cost is what we think is the right way to go about this. Within Intertanko, of course, When everything's going smooth, as was mentioned earlier, you don't see anything in the press. But when there is an incident, then questions come up. Well, what are those issues that we talk about at Intertanko? What was the cause? Who's accountable? Who's liable? Our owners are very concerned about that. Was there proper training, both of the crew and the pilot? And was there professionalism in how this was all handled? These are the main issues that are talked about at Intertanko. I joined Intertanko about 8.5 years ago. When I did, and I went to my first executive committee meeting in February of 2005, one of the issues on the agenda was pilotage. A little background about myself. I did go to the same maritime school that Mike Watson went to. He graduated many years ahead of me, that's why I can say I'm younger than anybody else in this school. Okay? But he was the smarter one. He graduated as a mate, went on to be a captain, and then a pilot. I was an engineer. I was down on the ship, steering. I had no idea where the ship was steering. I just made sure the ship was running. So I knew very little, if anything, about pilotage, other than what Mike told me, and I'll tell you about that in a second. So I sat there and listened to this discussion at our executive committee, and to be frank, the way pilots were discussed at that meeting were kind of the way they talk about pirates today. That's how they treated. The relationship between Intertanko and the pilots was not good. It was always blame, confrontation, and differing of opinions, really not trying to work together on this thing. Based on my experience at IMO, as the head of the U.S. delegation to many IMO meetings, well, I said, I thought we should figure out a way to go about this. And so the first thing that I asked them was, well, are you sure that every incident that occurs with a pilot on board is the pilot's fault? That's the simple question I asked as an engineer, logical engineer. And of course the answer I got back was, well, no, we're not. So the first thing I proposed then was, okay, let's take a new approach. I think our philosophy in dealing with these issues should be, there's always two sides to the story. Let's learn what the other side of the story is, and then let's see if we can work toward a win-win situation. And in all fairness to our executive committee, they're open-minded. They thought about this and they said, yes, let's proceed along these lines, Joe. You be the front man. I said, wait a minute, I'm an engineer. They said, Joe, you're the front man in dealing with this. We like the way you think in going about it. I said, okay, I'll be the front man on this and we'll see what we can do in dealing with this. Well, in order to do this, you have to start somewhere. You have to have a constructive dialogue. And that constructive dialogue has to start with trust. Where does that trust come from? I was somewhat fortunate. As I mentioned, I was the head of the U.S. delegation to IMO. In fact, I was the head of the U.S. delegation that negotiated at IMO Resolution A960 that we've heard about so much. And who was on my delegation that advised me on A960? Mike Watson, the president of IMPA, and Paul Kirchner, the executive director of IMPA. Paul said he'd buy me a beer if I mentioned his name, so that's why I mentioned his name, okay? But he was very important. He served as the working group, as Group 3 just told you, as chairman of the group. I put my trust in them back then, as head of the U.S. delegation. I said, Mike, Paul, you do what's best for the United States on pilotage, I will trust you. At that time I was with the government. Did they truly trust me? I don't know, okay? Whoever trusts the government, but I think they did. And we ended up with the development of A960. But from that, there was a basis for a trust. And in fact, it was Mike that came to me and said, Joe, before I said a word to him, he said, Joe, we've had bad relationships with Intertanko. You and I have a relationship that goes back. Maybe we can work together to try and improve the relationship between Intertanko and IMPA and API. I said, Mike, I have that mandate. Let's work together. And that's how we started. We started this cooperative effort in 2007. We started with some informal discussions, but there had to be a show of good faith to get started. There had to be a show of good faith. And in my opinion, I felt the burden was on Intertanko to demonstrate and take that first step in the show of good faith. Resolution A960 was adopted at IMO. It was agreed to by all the member states, but all the major shipping associations, including Intertanko, did not necessarily agree with it because it did not go far enough. The industry associations put proposals on the table when this was being negotiated to go and extend it further. Those extensions were not agreed to by IMO. I-960 stands as it is, but then Intertanko and other shipping associations went out and put a document out with what our guide we felt should be that exceeded these requirements. So, as a show of good faith, what Intertanko did in July of 2007 is that we wrote a letter to IMPA and said we would fully support Resolution A960, and then we went to the International Chamber of Shipping and told them to remove our name from the ICS Bridge Procedures Guide. That was our first step to move forward, and I think that was the building step that helped us move forward in a positive way to have the trust. We agreed to form a discussion group from then on and had meetings. Some of the things we talked about at our discussion group. We talked about bridge resource management. We talked about pilot and master bridge crew interaction. We talked, of course, about Resolution A960. We talked about safe boarding arrangements for pilots, and we talked about e-navigation. Now, when we talked about these things, we didn't necessarily agree on all of them. But the point is we had open dialogue. And by having an open dialogue, we were to get their views, and they got our views on what was going on. And that was the important point of what was going on, in my opinion, between Intertanko and IMPA and APA. Again, being an engineer though, there was what I called a defining moment. From Intertanko's side at this meeting was our Marine Director, Master Mariner, many years of sailing on the ship, our Chairman of our Pilotage Working Group, another Master Mariner, many years of sailing on a ship, and myself, the engineer, just trying to be the facilitator. To me, the defining moment was that as Paul and Mike were explaining to us the role of the pilot in the US, and Paul's going to go into this in a lot more detail here, so I'm not going to bother with it too much. The defining moment came when within that document, the statement reads, because of these duties, a compulsory pilot is not a member of the bridge team. At that point, the chairman of our pilotage working group and our Marine Director kind of said, oh, now I understand why IMPA takes the approach it does and how we deal with these issues. So in my view, this was a defining moment between Intertanko and IMPA and APA in going forward in a much more positive direction. And that was very helpful from our standpoint. Now, since then, of course, IMPA and Intertanko and APA have signed an historic memorandum of agreement to enhance tanker safety. Its purpose is to build and maintain the partnership, cooperation, and open constructive dialogue to promote maritime and navigational safety in pilotage waters. And this gives you a list of the objectives that we have and what we're trying to achieve through this agreement. We are, to the best of my knowledge, the only shipping association that has such an agreement with IMPA or APA. When this was signed, of course I have to give you the quotes. Captain Mike Watson, the president of IMPA, made his statements, but at the end he said, this MOA can serve as an example across the maritime industry. Our chairman, Graham Westcott, was very pleased with that statement from Mike, because he likes to be proactive and set the stage for the industry. That's why I was very positive. And from our standpoint, our chairman, Graham Westcott, he gave his quote, and his view was that this memorandum will demonstrate how much Intertanko appreciates the role of the pilots and the role that they play. So none of this negative criticism, but a positive way of building forward in dealing with this. The current state of play is that we've had annual discussion group meetings since 2008. The issues that we've talked about quite varied. We talked about the criminalization of maritime casualties, engine steering failures, pilot safety, et cetera, et cetera. Again, when we have this, we just had our last meeting, I think it was last month in March. Again, do we agree on all these? No, but we have an open dialogue and they understand where we're coming from. One other thing that we've done through this MOA to make it very clear to our members, and of course to IMPA members, we've gone out to our members and say, if you have any problem with any pilotage issues anywhere in the world, to let me know, me. What I do is, I get that, I call up Mike, and I say, Mike, this is what one of our members has advised us of. Mike then looks into the situation, and we talk to each other to see what we can possibly do to resolve it. So that open dialogue helps quite a bit in dealing with this issue. And I can only think it's positive because at least for more than the past year or so, almost 2 years now, I have not received one complaint from any of our 230 plus members on any pilotage issues around the world. So we think that's very positive. A few examples of some of the joint cooperation that we've done together since that agreement has been signed. Revision of Annex 6 on air emissions, the ROOC program, and a few things like that. Let me turn now to Intertanko in Brazil. Number one, I have to say this, of course, if anybody from Transpetro is here, I don't know, but I would say it anyway, even if they're not. Transpetro is Intertanko's associate member here in Brazil. We cherish their associate membership in Brazil. There's a gentleman, Eliseo Netta, who comes to our meetings as well as a few others, but Eliseo started this, and so we're very proud to have him there. I'll talk about him and others in just a second. Number two, since I took over as the Secretariat for the Intertanko Latin American panel, I've made sure we come to Rio as much as we can. We've been to Rio twice, first in 2006, and then just again last year. Quick side story on that. When I took over as the Secretary for the Intertanko Latin American panel, I was told they like to meet in Miami. So I scheduled a meeting in Miami. They like to come up, they bring their wives, they go shopping, fine. We had a good meeting, they went shopping, everybody was happy. When do you want to? I said, okay, our next meeting we'll have it in Miami. They said, Joe, why do we always have to meet in Miami? We're a Latin American panel. Why can't we meet in Latin America? I said, fine with me. I thought you wanted. They said, no, we want to meet in Latin America. I said, where do you want to go? They said, you pick. I said, okay, first meeting, Rio. That was 2005. And then what we did this just recently is Captain Tevio Fragoso of Conapra, who was mentioned also, Senior Vice President for IMPA, and also I understand former President of Conapra and former President of the Rio Pilots, and one of the best looking pilots I've ever met. We asked him to be a guest speaker at one of our meetings. What are you laughing for? You don't think he's good looking? Okay, I'm glad you agree. But we just had our last Latin American panel meeting here in Rio on October 31st, 2012. I mentioned Eliseo Netta, the executive manager for Transpetro fleet expansion. He came and gave a presentation on Transpetro plans for modernization of the tanker fleet, which was quite extensive, very informative. And then of course, Tevio, he came and he gave us a presentation on pilotage issue, both from IMPA's and Conapra's perspectives. More specifically, what Octavio spoke about. First, it was very educational. He gave us a very good overview of Conapra's organization, how they're organized here in Brazil, of their history, the legal mandates. The training requirements were very important because that let our members know how extensive the training requirements here with Conapra. And he also told us about the 22 pilotage areas in Brazil. He also talked about Conapra's plans to increase the number of pilots to meet what I understand was the increased vessel traffic in Brazil, but I understand there's also some other reasons for that increase, but the need to do that. And he gave us an overview of the new Superport ACU project, which will include terminals with an oil terminal at TX1 and TX2 with a shipyard. So he was able to let our members know in the Latin American panel all the different things that are going on, being considered here within Brazil on this matter. That in turn, I believe, resulted in a very good discussion within the Latin American panel about what's going on in Brazil. Of course, from our standpoint, we agree that the expansion of the oil industry and tanker usage off the Brazilian coast is important to Brazil, it's important to Conapra, and it's important to Intertanko members. Obviously, there's more business, assuming Petrobras uses our tanker members to come in. It's more business, but we hope it will be. And we agree that IMPA and Conapra and Intertanko members should cooperate to make sure we avoid any incidents in this new arena in Brazil, and work together and learn if any incidents should occur so we can prevent them from occurring in the future. And finally, we agreed that continuation of good working relationships between IMPA and Conapra and Intertanko members is based on mutual respect and support, which we believe is good for the maritime industry, and we should keep that dialogue going. So in conclusion, summary of all this, I would just simply say that from Intertanko's perspective, partnerships between tanker operators and pilots are essential in enhancing maritime safety. A cooperative approach is the right approach to do this. A confrontational approach has not been successful. We learned from that, and that's why we're taking a cooperative approach. To make sure you have that good cooperative approach, you have to have trust. We were somewhat fortunate in the relationship that I had with Mike, but that doesn't mean any other industry association or any other industry, any company could build that trust with whoever they want if you start with a good solid foundation and are willing to take the first step. And finally, we've proven that to the maritime world that trust can build a strong cooperative relationship, and we're going to keep that going as long as we can. I still have 15 minutes left, but I'm done. With that, I give you my final and only Portuguese word. Obrigado.